Hello out there. My name is Curtis Wolf, and I'm the director of the Kansas Wetlands Education Center at Cheyenne Bottoms. Today, we're going to step away from the wetlands of central Kansas and move to the streams of eastern Kansas in order to talk about a topic that I really think is one of the coolest things that's in the natural world. But I'm a little bit biased too. But it is actually one of the things that made me decide to want to be a biologist for my career, and I think you're going to find it pretty interesting as well. For about 3 years of my life, while I was going to graduate school at Fort Hays State University, I was what is called a malacologist, as you can see here, meaning that I was studying malacology, which is the study of mollusks. That's what I want to talk to you today about. Specifically, we're going to focus on one group of mollusks, which we have here in Kansas called freshwater mussels. Now, freshwater mussels fit into the classification system just like any living thing in the world. We can classify it and group it into various categories. Now, freshwater mussels, they are first of all in the kingdom Animalia, so even though they're simple animals, they are animals, and they fit the characteristics of an animal. Moving on down the classification system, they are in the phylum Mollusca. Now, mollusks are a very diverse group of animal that includes animals that inhabit a wide variety of habitats, including freshwater, saltwater, and even on land. Now, all mollusks have several characteristics in common, including they have bilateral symmetry, which means that they have a left and a right side. They also have a structure called a mantle, which is a fold in the body wall, and usually the mantle is what produces a hard shell, which most mollusks also have. All mollusks also have a muscular foot, which they use for locomotion, and they also typically have a specialized mouth part called a radula. However, freshwater mussels do not have the radula that other mollusks do. Now, mollusks in general include a wide variety of different animals. Snails and slugs. There's an oceanic mollusk called a chitin that you may know something about. Squids and octopi are also mollusks, even though they're highly modified and very different from a lot of the others. And then what we would call clams, which is, again, where freshwater mussels fit in. And so that's what we're going to kind of talk about. Ultimately, though, if we move on down the classification system, freshwater mussels within the mollusks are in the class Bivalvia, they're in the order Unionoidea, and then they're in the family Unionidae, which is the family of mussels that we have here in Kansas. Ultimately, though, mussels can be described as a two-shelled aquatic filter feeder. That's really what they do. Now, I want to go through just a little bit of anatomy of mussels, and I've got a couple shells here to show you a little bit of what a mussel is and what it does. Here's an example of a mussel that we have here in Kansas. Here's another one here, a pretty large shelled organism. Here's another one, so just to give you an idea of some of these. Externally, the shell of a mussel has several parts. The corner, the point of a mussel is actually a structure that we call the umbo. So you can see here, this is the umbo of the mussel. Within that, there is also a point where the two shells come together right next to the umbo, and it's usually a kind of some skin that goes across to connect the two shells. That's called the ligament. On the outside of the mussel shell, there's kind of a skin that we can call the epidermis, just like our epidermis, or a more technical term, it's called the periostracum. Okay? Most mussels, especially in Kansas, they can have various different things on the outside of their shell. Many of them have little knobs, or what we call pustules. I can give that an up-close view here. You can see the little knobs on here. They'll have various ridges on them as well. The other thing that's really interesting about mussel shells is they actually have rings, much like the rings of a tree. These are growth lines. You can kind of see the lines going down here. And as mussels grow, as the shell grows, they put on these lines, and we can actually use those to determine how old a mussel is. We can count the lines and just like a tree, and you can kind of see some of the major lines there as you go across that we could actually use to age this mussel. On the inside of the mussel shell, we also have some features or some anatomy that I'd like to point out. Most notably, on the inside we have these large teeth. Give you a view of those. There's a big set of teeth here that are used to hold the shell together, and these are called pseudocardinal teeth. On the edge here, there's also a tooth that interlatches with the other one, and that's called the lateral tooth. We also have muscle, actual M-U-S-C-L-E, just like our muscles in our arms or legs. Those attach right here where my two fingers are that actually hold the shells together. These are called adductor muscles, and so these are the scars where those muscles attach. Okay, and then that mantle that I talked about that actually secretes this shell is this line that goes right across here would be where the mantle is, and that's where the growth of the mussel shell is going to happen on that. So just a little bit of anatomy for mussel shells that you can look at. Now, when we talk about freshwater mussels, we have mussels have been used throughout history for many, many different reasons. If we go back prehistorically, up until colonization of the United States, mussels were used for tools and food. There we go. They were used as food and tools by Native Americans. The shells themselves would be used to carve out flesh off of bone of animals and that sort of thing. So used heavily by Native Americans. If we move up a little bit further, the mid-1800s, freshwater mussels were actually used and harvested in order to collect pearls. Much like their close cousins, the oysters, freshwater mussels will develop pearls on the inside, which happens when a grain of sand or some debris gets in there and it starts putting shell around it, basically, is what creates the pearls. And so many mussels were collected to search for pearls in freshwater mussels in the mid-1800s. Moving up to even further, many mussels were harvested in order to make buttons. As you can see in this picture here, mussel shells were harvested and taken to a factory, and a punch was used to punch out discs out of the shells, and those were actually used to make buttons. Now, you may have heard of pearl snap shirts, and that's where this comes from. Today's pearl snap shirts and buttons are usually made out of plastics, but at one time, mussel shells were actually used for that purpose. Moving up even further, from the mid-1950s up through today even, mussels are mostly harvested for the cultured pearl industry. What happens here is they get the shells, they grind up the shells and make little sand grains out of the shells that are then taken to usually Asia, and those little sand grains or the shell grains are implanted into oysters in order to make pearls that way, and they've been very successful with that. Ecologically, mussels have been used are not really well understood. However, they are very good filter feeders. They live in the streams and lakes and ponds, and they're very good at filtering water. They filter out plankton and other organisms and detritus that's in the water and feed off of it. Now, what they really are used for ecologically by scientists is an indicator species. Mussels are very susceptible to pollution, and so if they're in a habitat, they are going to be some of the first organisms that are affected if pollution or something is altered in the ecosystem. And so by monitoring mussels, scientists get a good idea of how healthy an ecosystem is just by seeing if the mussels are there or not. Now, looking at mussels in North America has more species of freshwater mussels with over 300 native species than any other continent. And the majority of those species are located east of the Rocky Mountains. Now, the hot spots for mussel diversity in the United States are in states like Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Each of those states has well over 100 species each in each of those states. Mussels are, though, considered to be the most imperiled group of animals in North America. That means that over 70% of the species of mussels are either extinct, they're no longer here, they're endangered, threatened, or in need of some conservation. And so many of the species of mussels are not doing very well, and that's something that is very concerning for scientists. Kansas is relatively low on the mussel diversity list with only 48 native species, but they have a similar trend as the rest of the United States, with over 60% of those species either being gone from the state or in need of some conservation. However, if we want to find mussels in Kansas, we usually have to go to the eastern third of the state. Out here where we live in central Kansas, we only have about 4 species of mussels that you can find in the streams and lakes and ponds here. If you go to eastern Kansas, though, that's where most of the diversity is. Now, I've got a table here that I want to show you that shows all the different species of mussels that can be found in Kansas. And I want you to look at this, and if nothing else, I want you to look at this table and just the only thing I really want you to take from this is how cool some of the names are. So this is the list of the 48 species that have lived in Kansas before, but check out some of these names. They're just great names for animals. And if nothing else, maybe at least you can get some new names to call your annoying brother or sister, such as a round pigtoe up here, or maybe a 3-horned wartyback. That's always a good one. Here's just a wartyback. Okay, if that's not good enough, maybe a pimpleback. Pimpleback is another great name. Here's a monkey face. And then maybe you can call someone a mucket. If that's not good enough, maybe call them a fat mucket. So it's kind of comical, some of the names that they've chosen for these mussels, but this is a list of all the different species that you can find in Kansas. Now, where do we find mussels? This picture shows a typical stream or river in eastern Kansas where mussels live. Now, streams are typically made up of 3 habitat types. There are pools where the water is relatively slow flowing, it's deeper, and usually you have a lot of sediment that's on the bottom of the pool. Then there's riffle habitats, which are very shallow and rocky areas where the water is very swiftly moving over the rocks. And then you have run areas, which kind of connect the pools and the riffles. And basically, mussels generally like to live in the riffles and runs of these streams. And those are, again, both of those are characterized by pretty shallow, fast-flowing water with very sandy and rocky bottoms. If we want to go look for mussels, we have to go where the mussels are, and that's in the streams. So, during my graduate work, I spent 2 summers with a crew of workers doing what we call mussel grubbing. Basically, we get in the stream and search with our hands along the bottom of the stream looking for these mussels. It's not a bad way to spend a hot summer day, so it actually is quite fun to do. Now, I'm going to go through just some of the species. We're going to go really quickly through several of the species that you can find in Kansas, just to give you an idea of the diversity of mussels in the state. This one is the largest mussel and heaviest shelled mussel in Kansas, called a washboard. These are the largest individuals, and again, we can age these, and these are some of the oldest mussels that you can find. Some of these have been aged to be over 100 years old and weigh several pounds. The maple leaf is a pretty common species in Kansas, and actually one that we do have around this area of the state, as well as in eastern Kansas. Here's the pimpleback, which you can see where it gets its name from these little pustules that are on the outside of the shell. Here's the monkey face, which can be a very pretty shell and have these big ridges on them. I'm not sure where they get the name monkey face exactly, but this is another common species in eastern Kansas. Here's one called a rock pocketbook with these large ridges and kind of bumpy appearance on the outside. The white heel splitter, which aptly has a name because of this large wing on the top side that sticks out. And if you stepped on that, you'd see where it gets the name white heel splitter. The Washita kidney shell is actually one that is very much of a concern to scientists in Kansas. Its numbers have definitely decreased quite a bit, and so this is one that scientists are watching, and it's been talked about being put on the threatened list federally. The three-horned wartyback is one that, again, you can see where it gets the name from those three big knobs that go down the edge of the shell, but again, a very common species in eastern Kansas. Western fanshell is another one that is quite uncommon, and one that we're really watching the numbers on. Western fanshell has also been proposed to be put onto the threatened list. The butterfly is a very pretty one with these nice little rays, these kind of pigmented rays, fine lines that go down the edge. Deer toes can be very pretty with also some nice lines on them. These don't get real large. They're about the size of a golf ball, and that's as big as they get, but some really pretty shapes and colors on them. Much like the white heel splitter, we also have a pink heel splitter in Kansas, which is only in a couple of the streams in eastern Kansas, but it obviously gets its name from the pink color on the inside of the shell. The yellow sandshell is a pretty common species as well, real light yellow color. The Neosho mucket is actually a federally endangered species, which we have here in Kansas, and Kansas is one of the places where you can still find them relatively frequently, but they are an endangered species, which is something that we're watching. One of the prettier mussels is this one called a plain pocketbook, which is, again, these bright green rays down the side, and this can be a relatively large shell, but they're a very pretty mussel too. So that gives you an idea of what some of these species are that you can find in Kansas. Now, I'd like to spend just a little time, talking about what really drew my interest about freshwater mussels, and that has to do with their life cycle. We're going to spend really the rest of the presentation talking about the life cycle of mussels, and the way it really works, it starts out with adult male and female mussels that live in the bottom of the stream, and they go through sexual reproduction just like most animals. Sperm from the males is broadcast out into the water, and then it's picked up by females and used to fertilize hundreds to even thousands of eggs that are within the female. The eggs develop, once they're fertilized, they develop inside the female's shell to a certain point. But the interesting part for the mussel's life cycle is that at some point, in order for the new mussels to continue living, they require a very unique step in their life cycle. The larval mussels, which can be shown right here, they require a time period as a parasite on a fish host. So these larvae actually attach to a fish and spend some time on there, maybe a couple weeks, and before they can actually develop the rest of their way. Different species of mussels actually require different species of fish in order to develop. It's a coevolution process there. After a couple weeks that the larvae is attached to the fish, they're going to develop a little bit more, and then eventually they're going to drop off, and hopefully they're in good habitat and can then grow into an adult mussel to finish out the life cycle. But what I'm going to focus on is the ways that mussels get these larvae attached to the fish. So this part of the life cycle is very important and very interesting. This is one of the coolest things about freshwater mussels, is how they get their larvae onto these fish. And so we're going to talk about that next. Now, how many of you like to go fishing? If you've gone fishing before, have you used a lure in order to try to entice a larger fish to bite? Well, believe it or not, some mussels actually have developed adaptations to go fishing for their fish host. Now, I want you to take a look closely at this photograph that I have on the screen. And I'd like you to take a look, and in this photo you're going to see that there's definitely a mussel that is here partially buried in the bottom of the stream with rocks. And then you have various fish, which are called darters. Now darters are a very good bait fish that a lot of larger fish like to eat, or would like to eat. And so from this photo, you might not have realized it, but one of the fish that you're seeing here is actually not a fish at all. And in fact, it's a lure. And what's even cooler is that this lure is actually part of a mussel. Now, this is an adaptation that this species of mussel right here has developed in order to entice a larger fish to bite at it. So looking at this photo right here, this is not a fish. This is actually the mussel's lure. So if this mussel can get a larger fish to bite at this lure, it's going to be able to complete its life cycle. So now every good fisherman knows that you have to make your lure as lifelike as possible in order to get a fish to strike. And a mussel, I would say, does a pretty good job in real life of this. This is a little video clip showing how that mussel actually twitches and moves this lure in order to make it more lifelike and hopefully fool the larger fish into biting it. Now, I have a quick video here that explains this process a little bit better. And this is, again, one of the coolest things and one of the reasons why I decided to become a biologist in the first place. So we'll take a look at this video real quick.
In the streams of Missouri lives the Lampsilus mussel, a simple animal with an extraordinary life cycle. To reach adulthood, its young must spend part of their lives inside a fish, the largemouth bass. To get there, the mussels must make physical contact, a difficult task, as mussels don't swim. But the bass has a weakness. It's a voracious predator of small fish, particularly darters. Even the slightest wriggle of a darter's tail will attract bass. Believe it or not, the fish on the mussel is an imitation, a perfect replica that will lure bass within striking range. The mussel can somehow sense approaching fish and wriggles its lure faster to entice them. If it gets the twitching just right, the remarkable likeness should do the rest. On impact, the mussel squirts its young into the bass's mouth. These snap shut on the gills, like spring-loaded traps. Here they stay, drawing blood from the fish, until several weeks later they drop off as tiny, fully formed mussels. Also a favorite prey of the bass are these striped shiners, and some mussels mimic them. Considering mussels are blind and have never seen a shiner, the likeness is incredible. The eyes, fins, and even the stripe look just right, yet the mussel knows nothing of its own appearance. These lures have evolved because bass more often attack mussels that look like fish, so fishy-looking mussels leave more descendants. After millions of years of blind evolution, this process of selection has turned mussel flesh into a lifelike lure. It takes a good imitation to fool a bass in clear water, and some of them are incredible. This darter mimic even has a mouth which gulps. This mussel is the same species, but its curious leopard print design may not find a taker, and its genes will go no further. This lure looks pretty good, but the bass is unconvinced and turns it down. Mussel lures are constantly improving, but fish are getting ever better at recognizing fakes. It's another arms race, and it's still creating diversity in the streams of Missouri to this day.
I hope that you enjoyed that video. Again, this is one of the coolest things that I think can happen in the natural world, and just has blown my mind away every time that I see that. Ultimately, what's happening here, so again, for a mussel being a very simple animal, they have developed some pretty complex means to keep their life cycle going. And getting those larvae to attach to the right fish's gills is just step one in making sure that the next generation of mussels can survive. And so keep that in mind as you go on. Ultimately, it's all about making sure that mussel survives. Now, different mussels have very different lures, and some even have different ways of delivering their larvae to the fish hosts. I want to show you another example of how this is done. A mussel that is not found in Kansas, but it is found in Missouri, is called a snuffbox mussel. The snuffbox's fish host is a small fish that's called a log perch. We actually do have log perch here, even in this part of the state. And log perch are very typically searching for food along the bottom of a stream, and they have its own adaptations of a very hard, bony snout that they use to dig through the gravel and the sand looking for insects and worms to eat. Now this video here shows exactly what a log perch does. Here is some log perch doing their typical thing, rolling stones over, looking for little insects to eat as they go. Now, the snuffbox mussel has cued in on this behavior of the log perch in order to deliver its larvae. Now, I want you to watch what happens when the log perch is searching for food just a little bit too close to this mussel. The mussel is working with this fish. So again, here's our log perch looking for food. Here's our log perch looking for food just like they do, but it gets a little too close to the mussel, and the mussel is actually grabbed onto the fish. But don't worry, it's only temporary, even though that fish has quite the look in its eye, wondering what's happened here. Now, this is not by accident that this happened. As we can see as we can see here by the edge of the snuffbox's shell, it's perfectly adapted to grab onto that fish and basically sink its teeth into the snout of that log perch. Now, here's what happens after it's grabbed onto that fish. Watch what the mussel does. So here, the mussel has attached to the log perch. In this video, which is sped up, we can see that the mussel starts pumping, and with each pump, you can see that the little larvae are just being pumped straight through the mouth and gills of that fish. Eventually, the mussel will let go, and the log perch will swim off, full of larval mussels, and will hopefully live long enough for the mussels to develop into juveniles to complete the life cycle. Now, there's still other adaptations that other mussels have developed in this game of fishing. Can you guess what type of bait animal that this mussel is trying to mimic with its lure? Any guesses? Does it kind of look like a crayfish? Possibly. There's also an insect larvae called a helgermite, which this one also is imitating. Perfect example of a bait fish there, or a bait that would entice a bigger fish to eat it. Still, other mussels use some less exotic lures. Some mussels simply put out a small strand that has an egg sac on the end that might look like a little worm or a small snail or food item that a smaller fish might eat. This egg sac, as you can see in this picture, is called a conglutinate, and it does the exact same thing as what we've seen in the other examples. Similarly, some mussels might just put out a little egg sac out into the water that will attach to rocks, and it might look like small insect larvae, again, that other fish might come up and actually eat, like this darter is looking at these little ovisacs here. Here's a little video showing the exact same thing. There's a darter. You can see it grabbed onto that egg sac, and you can see all the larvae being spit out all over, and hopefully those are attaching to that fish. And finally, here are some additional lures. This lure is a pretty nice lure that's attached to the mussel by a strand of mucus, but it doesn't look too different than some of the fishing worm lures that I've used to catch largemouth bass. So here's our mussel. This is the lure that's out on a little strand of mucus, and you can see where that might be a pretty good lure to attract a bigger fish. So, all in all, I just hope that you can appreciate what is going on in streams, even right here in Kansas, every spring. And just how important it is for this to go on if mussel species are wanting to survive. So I hope that this has given you a new appreciation for mollusks in general, and something that maybe you never knew existed right here in our state. So I appreciate you watching this lesson with me. I hope that you ask some questions, maybe even look into this a little bit further, because you never know. You too could be studying mussels someday. Thanks a bunch. Have a great day.